Okay, so on my clock it says 6 o'clock or 6 p.m. at least in South Africa. So I think we'll start the proceedings, and people will probably join in and out throughout the event. So yeah, so I just wanted to start by thanking you all for joining us for this discussion of the newly published volume, Anxious Joburg, The Inner Lives of a Global South City from Wits University Press. Before we start, I also want to thank Wits University Press for the book, for producing this important text, and thank Wiser for bringing us all together. And yeah, I'm grateful to all the panelists and contributors who will be speaking as we go along. So yeah, so my sort of introduction to the book, which I'm very excited about, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own relationship with Johannesburg. And then, yeah, then I'll introduce our main speaker for the night, for the event. My first encounters of Johannesburg were in books, mostly fiction and poetry, or historical texts. I imagined the city through the imaginations of others. I felt the segregation and dangers of being Black in Johannesburg. Then in the 90s, when South Africa became a democracy, Johannesburg opened up. My relationship with the city changed. Cross-border women started mediating the city for me. It was a city of prosperity, modernity, technology, and fashion. Traces of that were in our house, in my wardrobe, in my mother's kitchen, or the TV screen in our lounge. But in the 2000s, the Joburg of my adulthood has been a city of refuge, a city of escapism, a city of anxieties for my countrymen and women from Zimbabwe. Reading Anxious Joburg has been an opportunity to go under the skin of Johannesburg, to engage with intimate perspectives of life inside the city. So much has been written about Johannesburg, but Anxious Joburg proposes a different intellectual project and a different act of reading. And with that, I would love to introduce our main speaker, the globally recognized ebenist AbdouMaliq Simone. He works on issues of spatial composition in extended urban regions, the production of everyday life for urban majorities in the global south, infrastructural imaginaries, collective affect, global Blackness, and histories of the present for Muslim working classes. For decades, he has traveled across the world working with various municipalities, research groups, and social movements on issues of urban transformation. AbdouMaliq Simone is the author of many major books, including For the City Yet to Come, Urban Change in four African Cities, Duke University Press, 2004, City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, Routledge, 2009, Drawing the City Near, University of Minnesota Press, among others. Before I pass on the mic to AbdouMaliq Simone, I just wanted to say after his presentation, the editors of Anxious Joburg, the inner lives of a global South City, Nicky, Falkof, and Cobus van Staden will briefly respond and extend the conversation. Some of the contributors to this book will also join in. Thereafter, we'll open the session to everyone. So please do use the Q&A facility to post your questions, or the chat function, or raise your hand. So without wasting much time, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome AbdouMaliq Simone. Over to you.
Thank you, Tinashe. And thank you to Wiser and to the authors of the book for the book and for the opportunity to offer a few personal reflections on the book, which I was very happy to endorse and to read. It's a great read. I encourage everyone to pick it up and do what you will with it. So it's like the circulatory system of a city like Johannesburg. It only endures through more proficiently extending and deepening its articulations within itself and beyond. At the same time, it retains the materialization of hyper-visible inequity and oppression. And in a situation like that, a city will never adhere to a sense of fluidity, a sense of system integration or bodily integration. It's always going to be replete with frictions and blockages and surges and diverticula and anxiety distributing itself across that city, apprehended and felt, yes, in different ways, but also leaving no one unaffected. And so this is a kind of strange commons, more rhythmic than spatial. So anxiety as rhythm, as modus operandi, propulsion, channeler, vehicle of mutual possession, the situation where the city possesses you as you possess the city, and the materialization of entangled arrangements, the very means through which things, bodies, and materials feel each other out, the concrete vibrations, the sensibilities of an urban metabolic. And in the book, anxiety is a sign of what is to come, and partly based on the untenability of what now exists, but as well as in amplifying the ways in which what does exist is always haunted by or shrouded by what might have been, or actually might be happening right now, or a reified distribution of sense and power that continuously postponed its inevitable reckoning, its indebtedness to those aspects of itself that it repeatedly gets rid of, expels. And there's a lot about Johannesburg that has to deal with the details of paying attention. Because as Nicky Falkof says, it's a city that's short on symbols. And so Johannesburg always seemed like a city that demanded granular scrutiny, panoramic modes of attending to the smallest details in behavior and comportment, all part of some never-ending algorithmic run of compounding variables. Which side of the street to walk on, how fast to walk, how transparent one should be in conveying the degree to which you were indeed paying attention and to what specific aspects of the surrounds. I always found during the years of living in the inner city that things could change up really quickly, that few things had a sense of possessing a proper place, and thus an ethos of propriety that one could count on in terms of being able to make an appeal, have a recourse to reliable corrective interventions in the event that something went wrong. And in albeit a very minoritarian reading, and in contrast to the...
Sorry, AbdouMaliq. Someone says they can't hear you well, so I don't know if you can adjust your mic.
Yeah, it's on full blast.
All right.
Anxiety also seems to be a product of intensive contiguities with all of those spaces that remain either impenetrable, overly surveyed, or left to fend largely for themselves. Places like Eldorado Park, recessed in the interstices of countervailing representations between what's a white city, what's a black city. So many things that are imagined as out there, just over the horizon, barely contained, alternating between absolute irrelevance and vague threat. Few cities like Johannesburg have experienced such rapid demographic shifts in such short periods of time. And while the so-called informal settlements may have settled into familiar trajectories of incremental development and discernible frameworks of governmentality and livelihood, places like Diepkloof or Orange Farm, the inner city, even with its repetitive and partial gentrifications, remains an oscillating, turbulent panoply of shifts. Today, this space is used and occupied by a particular set of actors. Tomorrow is something else altogether. Of course, the book repeatedly points out how the contours of anxiety are not specific to the indeed singular constellations of Johannesburg's regional space, but enact and reflect the confluence of escalating tensions incumbent in intensifying segregations, inequities, indebtedness, and diversifying forms of the carceral that move with urbanization processes more extensive and extended everywhere. Here, anxiety seems to be imbricated in a generalized sense of unsettlement, of things being unsettled, and where unsettling of bodies, definition, function, territory, and social compacts, unsettling becomes an instrument, even an engine of urbanization inscribed in bodies, institutions, and landscapes. So unsettling in some sense drives a sense of urbanization, and that unsettling is in some sense reinscribed in the very composition and felt and feelings of both bodies, institutions, and even landscapes. It's hard for anything to sit still. It's hard to find stably plausible explanations, to cement predictable objects of attention and effective attachment. And even when people are stuck, immobile, unable to mobilize the minimum resources to get by, it is difficult to not risk everything. And for those with just enough to get by, it's difficult to commit to formulas that might have a probability of success in terms of maintaining that position. For there's always new things to pay attention to. There are new factors to consider, new lures of social advancement, and new indicators of vulnerability. When I lived and worked in the inner city during the 1990s, during the initial years of that decade, there appeared to be a window of opportunity whereby concerted efforts on the part of a broad range of municipal institutions might have grasped and organized the processes of transition underway. In the inner city, owners had not yet abandoned or ceased paying services for buildings. But many buildings were not yet hijacked by criminal syndicates. Streets were relatively safe to navigate at all hours, and a dynamic, multi-ethnic commercial base largely remained in place. Of course, the volume and intensity of demands made on Hillbrow and Berea and Joburg Park and Yeoville were enormous in terms of accommodating new residents and denizens from all over the country and the region, as the graying of demographic composition accelerated the transition of younger white residents into suburban domesticity. Incoming West Africans in particular saw the inner city as the availability of a kind of zango, a classic stranger's quarters that in other African contexts served as a locus of intersection for the multiple articulations of a city's economy with an expansive range of elsewheres. But for both Black and white residents, this shift in the inner city was a source of rampant anxiety. It was an additional headache at a time of national transformation that demanded most attention be paid to the townships. Still, the consequent anxieties of future years could have been availed a potential generative workshop of figuring and experimentation that was possible before the structural disattention to the inner city allowed it to be inundated with too many demands, conflicting ways of doing things, claims on limited space and resources. And so like this missed opportunity within the inner city of Johannesburg, an opportunity that was missed, but maybe nothing would ever have come out of it. Maybe the forces at work were just too great for any particular institutional actor to be able to reasonably try to steer it within generative directions. But there's something about missed opportunities, missed windows, a sense of things that have already been passed that always continue to haunt urban life everywhere. And in some ways, it is this kind of haunting of missed opportunities that in some sense characterizes the kind of anxiety of a city. And so I will leave it there and once again encourage. I mean, one of the great things about this book is that it has a lot of different kinds of registers and voices. It ranges from conversations in taxis to the urban myths of particular kinds of insects that are disappearing, and that disappearance in some ways constitutes a kind of disappearing of a sense of the material base of a city. So with its different registers, its different narratives, its different voices, it is a productively irritable book. It has many different kinds of rhythms, and it's a kind of book that is a good accompaniment to the notion of anxiety, which it attempts to explore. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, AbdouMaliq, for your opening remarks. I will, because I was very excited to introduce the event and the panel and everything, I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Tinashe Mushakavanhu, and I'm currently a fellow at WISER. So I think I will now invite Nicky, Falkof, and Cobus van Staden, the editors of the book, to respond or extend the conversation from the remarks that AbdouMaliq Simone has given us. And I think some of the contributors will also join us as they speak.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tinashe. Thank you, AbdouMaliq. That was really, really great. I think productively irritable is the most wonderful description of this book I could possibly imagine. Yeah, before I say anything more related to the book, I just wanted to reiterate what Tinashe said at the start, and just to give enormous thanks to Wits Press, who've been amazing in putting this book together and making such a beautiful book as well, and to WISER, who co-hosted the initial conference that the book came out of and are now hosting this event. So they've kind of, WISER's been there as a kind of a bracketing system at the very start and end of this project. In terms of the book itself, a lot of people have been asking why anxiety, particularly because it has come out at this point in history, and we're living through a moment of intensive global anxiety in a way that is condensed and codified more than I think it's ever been before, right? We are all constantly having conversations about the dissolution of the commons, the dissolution of what we might think of as our societies, the dissolution of our families. So we're getting a lot of feedback from people who are kind of going, wow, this is really interesting, it's really timely, it's really appropriate, how did you know? And the answer to that question is that anxiety makes so much sense as a way to understand not just Johannesburg, but also urban life, particularly urban life in the global south. I mean, AbdouMaliq, you said some really useful things about anxiety as a rhythm, as a kind of a mode of propulsion that possesses us as we possess the city. And for me, I think this is such a productive way of thinking about why anxiety is useful. Not to, veer left into embody talk about affect theory, which isn't my area and I can't really talk about it with any expertise, but there's something about the way in which feeling structures how we move through the city. And this city allows us to think about that in such a close and particular way. No one moves through the city in ways that are neutral. You are either afraid or you are swaggering. You're either walking and hustling or you are scuttling because you're worried about what might happen to you. There's a way in which the constant need to negotiate and perform the kind of social anxieties that we live with affects not just what we build, but also where we shop and who we talk to and how we move, and every single element of urban life that makes the urban so particular. And in cities like Johannesburg, these kinds of feelings often just get dismissed as fear of crime. right? That it's so simple, it's so simplistic, it's just we know the crime rate is high. But this is why we're so interested in the notion of anxiety, because there's something very specific. Kupana Rotele, who we quote in the introduction, calls anxiety objectless. And this is the point. The way that people feel in these kind of urban circumstances, it's not about being afraid of a specific thing or a specific person. It's about this constant unknowable condition that underpins urban life on a daily basis, of knowing that you need to be worried, but not knowing precisely what you need to be worried about. So, you know, another reason that we like the idea of approaching Johannesburg through anxiety is that even though the majority of the chapters in this book are about race, whether explicitly or implicitly, in fact, I would say that all of them are to some extent about race, talking about this as an instance of anxiety rather than as a book about race or a book about crime allows us to bypass these calcifications. So we can approach them sideways so that race is accounted for, but it doesn't have to be explicitly centralized in every single instance. So we can find different ways to have the same old conversations that people have been having for a really long time about the racialized spatialization of Johannesburg. And it's also, I mean, I'll finish off here, but we also just, you know, we're quite attached to using the notion of anxiety to think about Joburg and to think about South Africa, because it helps us to some extent at least, despectacularize how we think about the emotional conditions of living in this country, rather. It allows us to develop useful vocabularies for talking about how it feels to live here that don't always revert to the extreme conditions of trauma and pain. So anxiety can be really useful for thinking about this because it is persistent and ever present, but it's also not entirely debilitating, which means it gives us a way to talk about how people manage to live and actually sometimes live really well in a city that can be so pathological and so unkind to its residents. So as well as talking about the glamour of Joburg, the danger of Joburg, the fear of Joburg, this kind of approach also allows us to talk about the way that people manage to build, to carve out decent lives in such a complicated city.
Yeah, just to kind of move on from that directly. As Nicky mentioned, anxiety provided us a way of approaching a lot of you know, kind of quite well-established conversations about Johannesburg from an oblique angle, and to try and there was a moment in my mind where, where I started thinking of anxiety as, could this possibly be some form of commonality, between the South Africans? Because of course, one of the most, dominant kind of ideas or truths of Johannesburg and South Africa as a whole is how incredibly splintered the reality is, that there's very little shared kind of, thinking or kind of worldview between different kind of inhabitants of Johannesburg, and so it was a kind of very useful kind of space to start from. And then as we started working with the chapters, we realized that in a way it is true, because all of these different people in all of these different positions and backgrounds and so on, they all experience anxiety in relation to Johannesburg, but then the particular forms of anxiety then again shattered and fractalized, kind of into all of these other patterns, and there it became very rich for me to read all of them together, because in a way one can see, by drawing between the different chapters, you can see different actors impacting on each other, kind of like impacting and increasing the anxiety that other people are feeling. And in that, for me, was very well summed up in Sisonke intro, where she pointed out that no one who lives in Johannesburg is innocent. So we are devils all. We all are making someone else's life miserable. And the book was a way of kind of getting at that, while also digging deeper into the experience of being in a global South city rather than thinking about a global South city. So in this way, we located ourselves on the inside and worked outwards. Kind of working with all of these different authors, and I think they did it in incredible ways in pulling out different directions, from this kind of shared kind of space of kicking off by thinking about the city and about anxiety. And we ended up, the way that we put the book together, ended up being a kind of a refusal of a unified, centralized, narrative, one that becomes visualized in the way that the kind of blown apart map, that is in the beginning of the book. So, to finish off, I think what we'd love for this book to do, among other things, is to feed into conversations that's happening in other cities in the global south, to start shifting the idea of what it means to live in a big city towards the global south. We're so used to thinking about city life as London, Paris, New York, and to start having shared conversations in which the very kind of parameters of what urbanism means is filled in, kind of articulated from a place in the global south. That if the book can contribute to that process, we'd be incredibly grateful.
Thank you, Nicky and Cobus. I think as you can see, some of the contributors have already joined us on the screen. They will be speaking shortly. So the whole conversation is open. It's an open discussion. We didn't necessarily, build it around a theme. So I think in a way we're talking about the making of a book. We're talking and thinking and theorizing about a global south city, and in kind of our own relationships or experiences or readings of Johannesburg as a place and as a space. So I think, to everyone who is in attendance, you're welcome to share any comments or questions in the chat or use the Q&A function facility. So I think everyone is welcome to participate in the conversation. So I don't know if AbdouMaliq has any sort of reactions to what the editors have said about the book, and then I think we will be introducing some of the contributors, and they will probably talk about their own the stuff that they contributed in the book.
Just let the authors have a chance to speak, Tinashe, I think. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I mean, I guess to the contributors, Derek, Mingwei, Aidan, and Renugan, you can talk about your own contribution to the book or any aspects of the book that you want to bring to the table.
Is it okay if I just jump in and just say hi to everyone? It's so great to see all of you guys and to have this opportunity. And just to offer a few comments. One is kind of not a really clever or insightful comment, but just when I was working on my chapter, I was just gathering bits and pieces of anxiety and often literary examples, particularly of whites' anxiety in South Africa. And through the editorial process, Cobus and Nicky kept on saying, well, link this more to Johannesburg. And the more I did that, the more I realized that pretty much all the examples were so fundamentally grounded in Johannesburg that they wouldn't have been the examples they were without that context. So I think one of the things I learned about many of the examples I was using in the work that I was doing is that I didn't spatialize them quite as much as they needed to be until starting to work on the chapter. And that was a real connection, because those were forms of anxiety, which very much premised on various forms of race, racism, racialized identity, but they fundamentally were about Johannesburg. So looking over that again, even though some of those examples that I personally have utilized go across a different span of time, they're very much distinctively Johannesburg moments in an odd sort of way. So I just wanted to offer that, and then offer just two comments that were spurred that I started to think about after listening to AbdouMaliq's lovely introduction. And one is that the introduction to the book does a great job of highlighting notions of anxiety and different facets of anxiety, and also putting forward this idea that anxiety is a crucial motif for thinking about urbanity, about cities. So just 2 moments there. One is AbdouMaliq used this idea of anxiety as rhythm, which Nicky already picked up on. It's a wonderfully fertile phrase, I think, not just in as much as it suggests certain repetitions and patterns that might emerge from various atmospheric affects of anxiety, which is interesting to develop as well, but also because it links us back to temporality. And one of the things that I think is so useful about anxiety is it's not just static. It means that there's a relationship to the future. And I think that's also just a crucial facet of Johannesburg life, that future feels like it's always both tumbling ready upon one, that one might not quite have had one's foot right in the future that's already on top of one. But also anxiety is about the past. So you kind of get this double wave of the future being already on top of you before you were quite there, with the wave of the past kind of also crashing over you from behind. But then just the last point, and then I'll be quiet, is we've mentioned already Kupano Retele's notion of the objectless nature of anxiety. And I was very taken by this idea that anxiety is a productive device, both in literary, theoretical, conceptual ways, but also psychically, because particularly in psychoanalysis, we have this idea that sometimes in anxiety, we don't know exactly what's causing the anxiety. So sometimes there's a kind of unconscious dimension to anxiety, and the affect of anxiety is connected to something different from what may have caused it. So without elaborating too much on all that theory, this idea of multiple different connections and also multiple different disconnections from what seem to be causing anxiety, which I can't quite put my finger on, it's objectless after all, which becomes attached to new objects. This, to me, sounds like a very interesting kind of process of disconnection, reconnection happening again in multiple different ways. And that psychical pattern of connections and disconnections is also an interesting way of thinking about flows within urban life itself. So I just wanted to offer those comments and hear from my colleagues and panelists, see if I hear about your guys' contributions to the book and whether any of these ideas resonate.
Hi, can I have a chance to speak? And thank you everyone for organizing this event, and I'm very grateful, especially to Nicky and Cobus, for the opportunity to participate. So it's been very striking for me listening to the introductions, because my participation in this project has always been at a slight distance. So I wasn't part of the original workshop that laid the foundations of the book, and I submitted my chapter and did all of my writing from abroad. But what was really interesting listening to first Maliq speak and then Nicky's introduction was the way in which the sense that was driving this book really spoke to a lot of the issues that were underpinned in the work that I'd already done. And that's how especially Nicky was able to tap into a set of ideas as well as a set of affects and feelings that were underpinning a lot of the research that I'd completed a few years previously, but hadn't always been able to put my finger on it. And I think the notion again that Maliq pulled out very eloquently and that Nicky was underpinning is this idea of a generalized sense of unsettlement that characterizes daily life in the city that a lot of us call home. And for me, in the research I was doing in the inner city, there was always something that was never fully apparent. There were always questions when I was asking people about their lives and their connections and ways of living in the city. There was often a sense, not of evasiveness, but of people not being able to fully put their thumb on something. And that's something that they were articulating to me, often through not actually articulating it and not being able to put it into words, was what it actually means to live in a place that leaves you feeling deeply unsettled and deeply anxious. And these forms of anxiety that the people in my study were living with were multiple. When they were articulated, again, as Nicky pointed out, there was a sense of crime becoming the placeholder for people's anxiety. So people would tell me how in the inner city they structure their daily routines around when they think it's safe, when it's not safe, which streets they can walk down, which streets they can't walk down. But at the same time, everybody, the constant refrain I kept hearing in my interviews with people was how safe the inner city has become today and how livable it is now compared to how it was in the early 2000s or the late 1990s. But at the same time, people were still deeply anxious. And in my chapter, I try and tease out how this anxiety that people attribute to crime is actually a sense of a broader set of anxieties, and it's anxieties about people's place in the society that they're living in, whether it's due to their immigration status and their nationality, whether it's due to precarious financial circumstances, whether it's due to South Africa's deeply unequal land ownership patterns and living in buildings under somebody else's rules that you have no say in being able to influence at all, and you just have to live by these rules and abide by them. All of these forms of anxiety are there every day. And again, we tend to use crime as a placeholder, but there's something bigger that's often difficult to articulate and difficult to translate into our ways of being. And I think this book does a very good job in taking that step forward of thinking about what it means to constantly live with anxiety. The one question that I was left thinking about, though, after our other colleagues spoke, was though also to think about how anxiety does settle in the city. So we have a general sense of unsettlement, but Johannesburg is also a very good example of how a city's form and its concrete architectures and built environments, as well as ways of being in the city, are very much constructed around anxieties, whether it's the anxieties caused by white flight in the inner city, anxieties of crime, overly militarized spaces, or anxieties of always hustling, always not knowing how you're going to secure your economic future, how you're going to secure your right to stay in the country when immigration status is something that's so heavily and often covertly policed. So all of these forms of anxiety do settle in very concrete and meaningful ways. And they give rise to architectures like Staden City, or they give rise to architectures of carceration or constant surveillance and policing. So I think it's also important to think about how our built environment is also a product of a sense of very complicated, but also sometimes not that complicated forms of affect and feelings, and also who has the power to translate their anxieties into the built environment that very much shapes the ways we live. So, thank you.
I can jump in after Aidan's note about built environments. I'm really pleased to be on this kind of book launch today. I wasn't at the 2017 workshop you mentioned, but there was a 2014, I believe, workshop on Johannesburg at Weiser that I attended in the really early periods of my field work. That was very informative to how I was thinking about the city when I was getting started. And I really appreciate being able to think through one of the kind of oddities from my field work, one of these kind of one-off things that I wasn't quite sure what to do with, and place it in this book, in this kind of larger conversation about the city and its material bases and its built and unbuilt environments and how those shape socialities and are reshaped. Throughout my fieldwork, I kind of had, I would text Cobus these little anecdotes about the oddities of living in this house and have these conversations with Nicky. But I was thinking, just in my own kind of work on Chinese migration, contemporary Chinese migration to Johannesburg, the kinds of worlds that kind of these Chinese newcomers make, and the way that they inherit these built environments, and then they kind of make them anew. And it always was a way of kind of going back and forth to thinking about a lot of the work written about anxiety and security in kind of the northern suburbs, in large, predominantly white and upper middle class neighborhoods. And then thinking about the practices of these new Chinese migrants who come in after 94, who don't quite have that kind of history with the city or these spaces or with kind of race in these ways, but kind of slide into these material structures, enter into these really sedimented racial landscapes and these racialized geographies, and in some ways replicate the patterns, but they're not always the same. So I think I was thinking about what is distinctively Johannesburg about this, or what is distinctively Chinese about this, and is it kind of a hybridity? So those were some of the things I was thinking about. And I think one of the difficulties of writing about this was I wasn't really planning on writing about it when I was doing fieldwork. I also never imagined writing an entire book chapter on crime. These are things that I didn't think about when I started. But I think there's a way of being so steeped into these daily anxieties that sometimes it's hard to notice them, or you need some critical distance to notice them. But I ended up kind of in hindsight piecing together all of these random kind of photographs that I had taken of this house and all of these kind of peculiarities, and trying to write, a really humble, situated piece about a broader phenomenon. So I really appreciate having space in this collection to think through some of those things. In some ways it's quite bleak because it's the kind of the endurance of these racial anxieties that newcomers can kind of enter in and kind of inherit them and also remake them. So thank you for including me.
I guess I'm the last contributor to speak, but thank you all for your introductions. I found it very helpful to be in this volume because it came before I even began the fieldwork for my dissertation, which I have just begun writing at the moment. But it did offer a good way to think about my dissertation on gated community. As I read through the literature on estates and gated communities, that the common explanations that centered on fear of crime and the continuation of apartheid seemed to me like conclusions that one could come to without spending that much time in a gated community. And it also appeared to me that when I began doing fieldwork and did preliminary fieldwork, that the issues of racism that were brought up by many public commentators on gated communities didn't really seem to be the case in gated communities. So I started looking. The reason I took to the concept of anxiety was because of the objectlessness, and because it then offers a way to think about objects of our fears that haven't yet arrived, rather than using ideas like crime, which we're used to talking about in South Africa, to explain these new urban formations. And in particular, what I found interesting was that in crime talk more generally, there's such a routinized way to think about it that in many ways the affective structures that we then use to explain new built forms like gated communities have kind of already ossified. We already have an idea of what the kraal looks like, what the lager looks like, how we imagine crime, and yet people were developing new new political possibilities in their own, in how they lived in gated communities. In particular, I focused on nature and on people's kinship with animals. And as I looked more into it, it seemed to me that anxiety about nature could be described as anxious and objectless in another way, because nature was not only a source of anxiety because it could because it threatened to destroy property, or threatened to reduce property prices, or threatened to those who tried to control it in many ways, but also because it was the very thing that people used to justify their belongings in South Africa, under the idioms of stewardship and kinship with nature. And that then to me spoke to a new, an emergent attitude towards land ownership and property ownership at a time when we're discussing that, as you all know, that's a very hot topic in South Africa before 2018, but certainly since the beginning of 2018, when we started discussing expropriation without compensation. And so this has now, as I write my dissertation, kind of reorientated me to attunements to things in the world that we otherwise wouldn't expect, so that hopefully a study of gated communities can address more contemporary questions like the land debate, rather than constantly having to revert to more developed objects in our social imagination, like crime.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, as AbdouMaliq alluded to in his introduction, I think one of the special qualities of the book is the registers and voices that it brings together. So yeah, so I appreciate your voices and giving us a sense of how you approach the subject of anxiety, or how you read the experiences, your experiences of the city, or just read the city through the lens of anxiety. So if Nicky, Cobus, and AbdouMaliq have anything to say from all the things that have been brought up, you're welcome to take the mic. I have two questions, so which I could read out and sort of lead into the next maybe segment, and sort of bring people into the conversation. So the first question is from Michelle Small. Could you talk to how the use of anxiety might feed into pejorative assumptions? For example, migration, crime, terrorism, we all are devils, death, disease, disruption, disorder, decay, dangerous, about city living in Johannesburg and or global South cities, or entrenching a particularism about the urban in the developing world, the globe, or the global South. And then we have Ashim Bembe. First of all, I congratulate everyone for the book. One thing is to read, so he writes, one thing is to read a city through its material infrastructures, which include, as Malik famously wrote, people and bodies. Another is to read that same city via what we believe is its affect. In this case, something as intangible as anxiety. Do the contributors to this volume presume that a city has a psychic life? How can such a life be retrieved? What methodology? What type of clinic? How do you define anxiety? Are you suggesting that Johannesburg is a psychotic city? And lastly, Shakira Chauhan says, I'm curious to know the extent to which women of color voices have been included in the contributions and perspectives, in addition to Mingwei's. I believe this is a crucial aspect of consideration within this framing. So yeah, the questions are open. Anyone can come in.
Okay, well, I'll jump in and answer the first question. Michelle Smalls, I'm just having a look at this again. Okay, so you're asking how the use of the idea of anxiety might feed into pejorative assumptions about city living in Joburg. And, you know, interestingly, this is really one of the motivations behind undertaking this project in the first place, is that we kept running across the way in which, you know, if we think about anxiety as a kind of a pervasive condition, you know, we're taking a lot of our ideas from the work of Zygmunt Bauman and the stuff he does about liquid modernity and cultures of fear, but shifting the talk of fear onto a broader, less specific, I guess, more objectless frame of anxiety, and thinking about the fact that that is so common and that seems to be such a central part of life. What does it mean that cities in the global south are always the object of everybody else's anxiety, right? What does it mean that within a global imagination, which unfortunately to a large extent, because of the, you know, mediatization of modern life, is to some extent still a westernized imagination, that the cities that we live in, the cities that, you know, are really manifesting the most hypermodern city forms that we have, are seen as nothing but a locus of anxiety for all the fears of the Northern Imaginary, the place where migration comes from, the place where terrible diseases like Ebola spring up out of nowhere, or, you know, we all know what the global imaginary thinks of Wuhan. So actually, I don't think that thinking about anxiety in Johannesburg is necessarily pathological or pejorative. Of course, you know, some people are going to read the work that way. But what we're trying to do specifically is go, if anxiety is a fundamental underlying condition of modern life, what does it mean to think about what that feels like, not about the South, but actually in the South? So what we're basically doing is we're trying to make an argument that anxiety is a hypermodern condition, and we cannot understand this hypermodern condition without looking at it outside of the parameters of northern cities.
I think I'll take a first stab at Achille's question, but then Nicky, please jump in. You know, this is like very, very rich questions. Thank you so much. And I already feel myself falling short. But the I think yes, like that is essentially the idea of you know, that Johannesburg is one of the most well documented and most written about cities in Africa, and a lot of the work that's gone into that is analysis of spatiality, of infrastructure, of, you know, and of course, you know, kind of some of the work coming out of Wiser, you know, kind of really fundamentally contributed to that conversation. We as you say, we essentially started from a kind of an affective place, or just kind of through this kind of intangible concept of anxiety, and with that we were making a distinction between anxiety and fear, and from there we were also trying to get at a kind of a weird reality about Johannesburg, where, you know, kind of Johannesburg, like if you speak to Johannesburg people, they you know, kind of it's easy to have a conversation about horrifying things in Johannesburg. You know, kind of like at any dinner party, you know, kind of you basically just have to sit down and people tell you terrible stories. But at the same time, being in Johannesburg, it's not like being in Yemen, or, you know, kind of at the moment, or, you know, in other kind of in a war zone, or in, you know, kind of in a city with where you see kind of violent acts on the street corner every single day in every part of the city. A lot of Johannesburg is quiet, and of course here class, race, and all of these different kind of inequalities play very strongly in. But, you know, in interesting ways, Johannesburg is this kind of corrective to this kind of cliche or stereotype of the ever bustling, extremely lively global South city, because, you know, kind of like Johannesburg, one big part of living in Johannesburg is this reality that at night everything shuts down, like the whole city is kind of divided by these buffer areas. There's a lot of kind of dead space, or, you know, kind of nondescript space, where the emptiness and the publicness of that space kind of is implicitly a threat. which comes with an issue that I dealt with in my own chapter, which is that visuality itself is linked to violence. You know, so the very act of being outside in public space is itself just coded as dangerous itself. So we were trying to get at what there's this kind of constant underlying hum of this kind of affect that underlies life throughout the city in all of these different kind of places that have so little to do with each other in other ways. And so you know, kind of anxiety was a very valuable kind of position to kind of think about what that kind of, like, you know, that kind of feeling of being ready all the time for something that might come, but we're not sure exactly what. You know, what that kind of affective position means, particularly when it then is linked to this incredible, all the incredible inequities in the city, and also the ways that those inequities are then manifested through infrastructure and spatiality. Nicky, do you want to take over from there?
AbdouMaliq, yes, you can join in.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I think it might be important to in terms of thinking about anxiety, not so much to think about it as the relationship of individual residents to the city, not so much the purview of the reaction of individuals to their experience of the city, but rather the body of the city itself. And to what extent is the body of the city itself a kind of anxious body? And what would that mean? I mean, the old Chicago school notion of the urban metabolism was predicated on an image of the city as a body that had some kind of coherence with its diverse but interconnected parts, its flows of energy, its all the diverse functioning, but that was in some ways held in concert by the image that somehow the city had a kind of fundamental coherence to it, that was always going to be recalibrated, always faced particular kinds of needs for adaptation, but in some sense, the image of a kind of fundamental coherence. But we also know that metabolism has its own alterations, its own propulsions, its convulsions, its the ways in which the presence of bacteria and viruses and blood pressures and all these kinds of alternating rhythms which threaten in some ways the kind of coherence of that body. And so when Johannesburg is posited with this image of being a kind of world-class African city, the only way that it can attain that is that if it finds some kind of way to make everything that's there now count. But that means trying to make the logics of the ways in which taxi drivers determine their routes and their parking count. It means having to find a way in which, before, in Aidan's chapter, before the inner city became so militarized and disciplinary in terms of the way in which apartment life was structured, the ways in which residents, entered into all different kinds of there's so many different kinds of things that have to be made to count. But those things that have to be made to count are so disparate, are so unequal, are so dispersed, are so arranged in a way which doesn't approach having any kind of overarching sense of coherence. So that there's something about the sheer operation of the body of the city, which is in some ways anxious because it doesn't have that kind of image of a kind of coherent body. It isn't mapped in that way. It is a body which continuously convulses. It convulses and it settles. It finds new kinds of basins of meaning. It finds new kinds of loci of of rearrangements, and in some ways, the operation of that body itself is in some sense anxious. Now, so what's important in some ways is then to think about that notion of the collective body in relationship then to the individual psychological reactions to the, so it's not so much that, it may be that Johannesburg is a psychotic city, but it's in terms of thinking through about what are the operational rhythms and modus operandis and propulsions and energy fields and the synaptic relationships, the interfaces within that kind of collective body, and then think, okay, what does that have to do with the way in which individuals respond to that kind of situation?
Wow, thank you. Yeah, I think thinking about the collective body or the body of the city, I have these three questions. So the first one is from I've missed the name, but Mary says, I like the way Johannesburg is considered from a psychological perspective. What about those that are residents, in brackets, homed, as opposed to those that are homeless? I would also be curious to see how other South African cities are diagnosed according to psychological viewpoints. Question 2, Paola Prandini says, I would also like to know what were the transversalities of aspects of race and gender among the articles on the book. And Liz Ghana says, if you took Cairo and Kinshasa as the cities of the global South, what commonalities of affect would you look for with Johannesburg? What kind of imaginaries of anxiety? So, yeah, for now we can work with those three, and then
I'm just gonna hop in because we missed a question, and okay. I think it's quite an important one. It was posted by Shakira Chauhan, who asks, she's curious to know the extent to which women of color voices have been included in the contributions and perspective, because she believes this is a crucial aspect of the framing. And before I answer that, I just want to, acknowledge one of the necessary weaknesses of this kind of project. I mean, I think as we've all been suggesting, despite the way we're trying to collectivize the notion of anxiety as something that is fundamental about the city, we are also, it's crucial to acknowledge that Joburg is not homogeneous, right? It's not spatially homogeneous. It's a hugely unequal city. It's a geographically very large city. There is no way that a book project like this can cover every element of the city. So as Sisonke Simone says in her introduction, this is a book about Johannesburg, not a book about Soweto. A book about Soweto would be very different. So there are lacuna in this book. There are things that we've missed. There are things that we haven't covered. In terms of centralizing the voices of women of color, I mean, this is something we have. A lot of the contributions do this. I mean, of course, we have an amazing chapter by Lebohang Masango, who's here but can't log on because her connection is too bad. But many of the other chapters touch on the lives and perspectives of particularly Black women who have to traverse the city. So, this comes up in Cobus's chapter, it comes up in Aidan Mosselson's chapter, it comes up in Sabelo Mlangeni's photography, it comes up in Bikaminga's chapter about transgender refugees. But most importantly, it comes up in the stories that are told by a young storyteller called Baletsi Tsatsi, who relates throughout the book these tales of taking taxis throughout Johannesburg. And we brought her in specifically and tried to weave these throughout the process of the book, because even though Joburg can be so stuck in so many ways, it's also fundamentally a city of distressed mobilities, right? So we were trying to have her voice as a kind of a weaving pattern of what it feels like to be vulnerable in that particular way as a young woman who wants to own the city, who wants to take ownership, who wants to live in it, who wants to live in it in a non-anxious way, and who is not permitted to, but yet who somehow has to go and forge some sort of space for herself, despite all of the multiple blockages that she faces. So yeah, those voices are there, but they're just not on the screen.
And maybe that answer, I think, links to Sarah Gibson's question on mobilities and anxiety. Njogu Morgan, who's one of our contributors, like he really delved into that issue by focusing on the very complicated politics of cycling in South Africa, which is a very fraught thing to do. Nicky knows that, on a daily basis, and it's kind of like his focus on cycling, I think, it's a very rich one because it really concretizes these kind of conflicts, because in some kind of ways, a cyclist can move more efficiently through the city. In other ways, being a cyclist also makes you incredibly vulnerable. So it literally is both, like anxiety is both propelling you forward and holding you back at the same time. And I think that then becomes, there is, I think, an aspect to that kind of, this kind of affective state that we're talking about is, one aspect of it is this kind of feeling of kind of spinning your wheels, of trying to get somewhere, but kind of not making it. I think Bailetzi's stories really make that clear. And to connect this back to Achille's question, I think I've started to think that one of the things that I'd like to think about more in relation to these issues is the physical chemical cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which is also which has been kind of isolated as particularly kind of health aggravating or kind of aggravating kind of issues for people who suffer from diabetes. And of course, diabetes is a pervasive problem in South Africa for a lot of kind of historical reasons. And I think there is really, in terms of the body of the city and the circulation through the body of the city, I think this idea of all of this stress and anxiety that is never released, literally starting to chemically change the body and making that body ill, and how that illness manifests in the individual level and on the city level. I think we need to start thinking about that. It also links to some of the comments that Sarah made in her discussion on the book, in positioning all of this inside climate change, kind of, which adds another kind of layer of this kind of simmering, kind of spinning your wheels kind of anxiety that you can't go anywhere with. There's no way of really like dispelling your fear of climate change, which kind of is kind of, again, is something that Nicky touches on in her work as well. So yeah, there's kind of there's a lot of work to be done.
We have more questions. So I think we have roughly 25 minutes. So I'm going to read out the questions, respond to whatever speaks to you. I think it's important to just bring them up so that we can think about them in this forum or beyond the forum. So I think Duet Beam says, how does your notion of anxiety in the book intersect with the broader frameworks from which it is borrowed, that of mental health? Site terminology carries a remnant implication of pathology and normalcy and points towards an imaginary of life as is somehow free from it. Shan Lavari says, congratulations on a really amazing book. It feels finger on the pulse intellectually as well as about what it's like to live here. Simple question. What were your thoughts on choosing Joburg for the title as opposed to the alternatives? And Ellison Tijerera says, can any of the contributors speak to the register of anxiety in relation to xenophobia? Can the practice of embracing anxiety allow one to keep xenophobia in check or at bay in a city like Johannesburg? And then lastly, Clara Vutoft says, using anxiety as a lens method for starting inside to look out, what does it suggest about the future, about the past? What moments and trends in time does the book uncover? Perhaps a question similar to the thematic conversations already covered, but I'm interested in what unique insight view snapshots of time space you have documented. And yeah, lastly, Dudusi Albert Ntuli says, I used to own a house in Yeovil, which in my opinion is the most practical example for United Africa at a micro level. Does the book touch on the tensions between locals and foreigners and between non-South Africans themselves, where fears of citizenship, ownership are determining factor of anxiety? So yeah, it's a lot to take in, but I guess yeah, you can find a way to get in, or at least let you on something, and we continue the conversation. We have 20 minutes left, so try to be brief, and yeah, thank you.
The first question about the nature of anxiety, I think Derek should probably answer if you're up to it. He definitely knows more about this than I do, but I mean, I think just in terms of the idea about anxiety intersecting with broader frameworks for mental health and the remnants of pathology and normalcy. I mean, I think what we are trying to do in using anxiety as a metaphor is actually move beyond the pathologizing nature of anxiety as an affective condition by trying to suggest that it is something that is not individual, right? That it is somehow collectivized, and that it is somehow a consequence of globalization, neoliberalization, urban city forms. So, I mean, I'm not sure whether we've entirely succeeded, but I think the point in treating anxiety in this way is to suggest that far from being something pathologizing, it is actually just something that is kind of quite inherent at the moment.
I mean, maybe just to say 2 or 3 things about anxiety. There's nothing inherently pathological about anxiety. I mean, anxiety is, you know, all these philosophical traditions want to tell us this, but it's very much part of the human condition, which is not to say that it doesn't take on specific forms, more acute forms, you know, clustered forms in certain times and places. But I suppose 2 broad kind of socio-political points could be made about it. One is that the problem is not so much anxiety, but how we rush quickly to find a treatment for anxiety, which typically takes the form of a phobia. And that sounds a little counterintuitive. Why would a phobia be a treatment of an anxiety? Well, if an anxiety is by definition objectless, one way to stabilize it and to create a focus for it is to have a phobic focus. And in the history of racism and Fanon, you know, Fanon says that blackness in the colonial world and the anti-black racist world becomes a phobogenic object. And I know one of the questions was about xenophobia. So the problem, I think, is less about anxiety than the rushed attempt, the desperate attempt to avoid anxiety. And Renugan also, I think, mentioned this, just talking about those different living spaces whereby suddenly crime becomes a nucleus of a nodal point, an oft-referred thematic, which seems to somehow give us a focus for our anxiety. So whether it's racism, whether it's xenophobia, whether it's crime talk, those you could say are desperate attempts to avoid anxiety. And sometimes they create a certain stabilization. But I think in most of the most interesting analyses of these things, we start to find that those aren't, they don't do the encapsulation of all the anxiety that is there. So I suppose one question then would be, how could we live anxiety more productively? What is the creativity of anxiety? What other connections could be made? And then, yeah, I mean, I see there's 2 questions saying, well, you know, do we not risk a certain pejorativization by making this reference to the language of the psychological? And I think that's true to a certain extent, but I also think that anxiety per se isn't necessarily pathological. But we can find politically pathological forms of how we have attempted as a society, whatever, you know, xenophobia presumably being one. I'd be interested to hear what other people say. Maybe just one brief other comment. Achille Mbembe had this comment about, is Johannesburg is a psychotic city? And in a kind of playful response, I was tempted to say, maybe, not in the sense of psychosis as a severe pathology, because in some theoretical backgrounds, you can say, well, you could have a psychotic structure that doesn't necessarily mean it's pathological or even overtly crazy. But it would be interesting to ask some questions about that. If we were to think metaphorically of Johannesburg as a psychotic city, that might mean we should ask, is it a stabilized psychosis? And if it's a stabilized psychosis, that seems to suggest that there would be forms of foreclosure, in other words, more dramatic than just repression, fundamental facets within the city or of certain communities' experiences of the city are almost foreclosed as if they don't exist on the map. That would be one metaphorical avenue to develop in thinking of Johannesburg as a kind of stabilized psychosis. And another would be just to ask, in a case of psychosis, and again, this is metaphorical, right? So we're not trying to pathologize Johannesburg. The other would be to say, in many instances of psychosis, there's a great deal of difficulty in establishing a social bond or a durable, ongoing social link, a connection, a structural type of relationship. And if that's true, then you could say that maybe one of the interesting, invigorating, and also frightening facets of living in Johannesburg is the constant challenge to recreate micro precarious bonds or routes or channels or links from one part of the city to another part of the city that might be highly anxious, but that might also create a great deal of creativity and idiosyncrasy to make them work. Anyways, just some thoughts.
I can jump in quickly just to answer a different question, which is Nduduzi, Albert, and Tuli's question about xenophobia and the relationship between locals and foreigners. We do indeed have a chapter on that. B. Kaminga's chapter focuses on transgender refugees and their struggles to find a place in Johannesburg, and frequently also their struggles to get away from Johannesburg, because a lot of them tend to want to rather spend time in Cape Town, which has an image as a more LGBT friendly city, and one where there's more NGOs and other kind of structures to help LGBT refugees. This touches on a wider issue which we haven't dealt with a lot in this discussion, which is that there's one of the difficulties of writing about Johannesburg, and you know, I think this is something that we wrestled with as well, is that there is the danger of treating Johannesburg as this kind of unique case study or unique environment that is somehow cut off from the larger kind of dysfunctionalities of the South African state. And I think B. Kaminga's chapter is really great on that point, because they point out that you know, a lot of these problems that face LGBT refugees actually come with increasingly punitive and increasingly kind of obstructive kind of immigration and asylum practices set up by the state. So the state is making it harder and harder to apply for asylum by kind of limiting the number of asylum centers, and you know, kind of forcing people to come to Johannesburg, where they then face a particularly kind of hostile environment. So and then, you know, kind of several of the other chapters, including in my own, we were trying to kind of bring together some of these issues of the wider kind of, you know, contradictions of contemporary life in South Africa, and we were writing it really at the end point of the Zuma era, and right at the moment where it was transferring to the Mbeki era, and where there was the first, like, you know, consistent kind of judicial attempts to try and deal with all of the kind of corruption that came from state capture. And you know, it becomes very difficult to pick apart Johannesburg from South Africa, and I think in a lot of ways one shouldn't. You know, and you know, so that was it feeds back into this issue, you know, and just kind of, I think, you know, it's a kind of a challenge, an ongoing challenge in Johannesburg writing and Johannesburg thinking. I think to really draw the line of where we're talking about specifically about Johannesburg and where we're talking about the wider kind of context within which Johannesburg is happening.
Aidan, do you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to come in again on the question on relations between South Africans and people of other nationalities. So my chapter touches on that briefly, but in my broader research in the inner city, particularly in areas of Hillbrow and Berea, I actually, I think it was generally quite a rosy snapshot that I got, but I did get a strong sense of people actually forging quite strong communal and interpersonal relationships across national identities, particularly in cases where people were subletting flats and you had various groups of people from different nationalities in a way forced into it due to economic circumstances, but making the best out of it and forming some forms of loose family relationships across national identities. But at the same time, and I think this does come through in the chapter in the book, in the interviews I did, again, there was this sense of anxiety and precarity, but it was importantly heightened for people from different nationalities in ways that it wasn't for the South African interviewees. So there was a very short quote, which I think is in the chapter, when I was talking to a young man from Zimbabwe who said very simply, you never feel safe in South Africa. And he didn't elaborate on the contours of what he meant by that, but in that very short sentence, he encapsulated a lot in terms of economic precarity, fear of crime, like we've spoken about, but also this vulnerability to this very violent nationalism or xenophobia that is a prevalent undercurrent in particularly the inner city, but also in other spaces of South Africa. So I think when we're talking about fears and anxieties, it's important to find the instances of communalism and people forging new types of relationships that reject a lot of the stigmas and a lot of the structures that we've been made to believe we should live with. But it's also important to remember that these are very real realities for a lot of people. And then just on the question of embracing anxiety as a way to keep xenophobia in check, I'm just not sure whose anxiety the question's referring to. Because if we want to understand some of the driving causes of xenophobia, I think it's good to recognize some of the underlying, if we want to call them anxieties, that are causing it, and that goes to deeper structural issues. So I think when we talk about affect, we always need to understand it as much as it's psychological. It's something that's structurally produced and that stems from anxieties of economic precarity, anxieties over maybe masculinity at times, and of a failed form of citizenship, which manifests in cases as violence targeted at people we label as foreigners. I think there's also important issues of anxieties over Blackness that that come to the surface in moments of anxiety. So it's obviously very telling that people who cite unfair economic competition on the part of people they label as foreigners aren't going and committing violence often against white people who have seized the land and seized economic opportunities, but targeting Black people who are more vulnerable than themselves. So I think rather than trying to put a lid on that, it's better to unpack and understand the sources of this very violent strands of xenophobia that run through a lot of sectors of South African society. Again, and xenophobia can also manifest in unviolent ways in talk of what we call foreigners and how people relate to it. What it means to live as someone labeled a foreigner in South Africa and how you put a handle on those anxieties, I'm not even going to try to begin to talk about that, because that's something that's very far outside of my realm of experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have 7 minutes, and I think I'm going to invite the speakers to just give brief remarks before we close the session. Yeah, it feels like it's starting, and yet we don't have more time to, sit and continue the conversation. So I will invite the speakers to just give brief remarks on things that have come up, or maybe the ways the conversations will move, especially as the book is out, and what we can be thinking about.
Okay, I'll jump in. I want to thank everyone for their questions that have been really perceptive and really thoughtful, and actually given me quite a lot of stuff to think about in the future. One thing that I've been kind of mulling over since AbdouMaliq kicked off this whole session, given my own interest in the work of Zygmunt Bauman and how he, not to be too dogmatic about it, but how he talks about liquid modernity. He talks about liquidity as a kind of a sense of instability, unsettledness, but then the way in which we're talking as well about Johannesburg as a place which has a complete lack of fluidity, where mobility becomes incredibly difficult rather, and class mobility becomes incredibly different. Just physically getting around the city becomes incredibly different. I feel like there's a really important tension here between the fluidity of being unsettled and unfixed, and the lack of fluidity that also comes along with a different type of being unsettled and unfixed. So I think that one thing that this conversation has done for me is help me kind of put my finger on the fact that this is one of the things that puzzles me the most about Johannesburg, is that it is a city that changes so fast, but it's also a city that still is organized in the same ways, in so many ways, that it was organized under apartheid. It's incredibly shifting and it's incredibly mobile, but it's also unbelievably fixed in other ways. So I think for me, you know, this kind of tension between motion and enforced stillness is also a very particular form of urban anxiety, that the motion that we have is we are often buffeted, and it's often non-agential motion, and then the stillness that we have is also non-agential because people are blocked. So I think there's something in this relation between anxiety and mobility that for me is very productive, and I'm going to go away and think about that.
I'll jump in quickly after. Yes, I'd just like to echo Nicky's thanks, all of the fantastic questions. I'm just sorry we couldn't answer all of them. And you know, a lot of them because we don't know the answer. You know, so you know, one of and then of course to all of the, you know, to everyone who made this book possible, we're so incredibly grateful. One of the ways that I think would like to take the conversation forward, and one of the things that I'm really thinking about is the kind of you know, in my own chapter, I was looking a lot at the impact of kind of global structures, like in my case, the Global Citizen Festival, that whole festival, NGO, you know, kind of and kind of international philanthropic media, you know, kind of engagement and its impact on an actual place like Johannesburg. So just, you know, kind of, and I'm thinking a lot more about those issues. So just to give you a very concrete example, a very Joburg example. So I was mugged last week, and my phone was stolen, and that was pretty stressful. I mean, it was an extremely stressful experience. But what ended up being, in weird ways, even more stressful was once I got a new phone, was like, you know, kind of getting myself signed back into all of these kind of transnational entities. You know, kind of I kept kind of being kind of trying to sign into my own email accounts, and then getting these, you know, kind of these, you know, messages from Google being like, someone is trying to hack your account, and I'm like, it's me. You know, so it's you know, so the kind of car crash between a very extremely complicated place like Johannesburg, and then the kind of powers of transnational capital that are increasingly kind of drifting away, like where the true sense of power in a lot of kind of transnational capital is drifting away from any kind of institutional control. You know, the kind of overlap between those kind of factors, I think, is something that we need to think about a lot more, particularly because, you know, South Africa is already in those structures. You know, kind of it isn't a kind of a classic kind of post-colonial developing country, you know, situation where South Africa is exiled from all of these structures. South Africa, for example, is a G20 member. You know, and South Africa has ideas about how it acts within these structures, but the way that these kind of transnational kind of currents are affecting South Africans, and particularly poor South Africans, is something that I'm increasingly thinking about. And I think anxiety is actually a pretty good place to start thinking about that, actually. Thank you so much.
I don't know if AbdouMaliq has any last word for us before, you know, we go.
No, just to quickly extend Nicky's point. I mean, it's not that urban residents have never been mobile. They've always been mobile. But in my experience working in across different sort of urban regions of the South, I've never seen a moment where people they're just not sitting still. And this is cutting across all swathes of the urban population. In part, there was an attempt to intensify a sense of settlement. You see in Brazil and South Africa and India the way in which people were encouraged to buy their way into a sense of being middle class through debt-fueled consumption. And then discovering that, once they bought their way into the semblance of being middle class, that they were never really middle class. And even if they were, it didn't really mean all that much. So in some sense, this not sitting still doesn't entail a rush to resettle, to re-find a place, to acquire assets, to acquire property, to acquire a position, to acquire a place. In some ways, these kinds of decisions that may still be on the level of the imaginary, of desire, are being deferred. So people are in motion, but as Nicky said, they're in motion within a kind of material and inbuilt environment and Aidan as well, that is heavily sedimented, heavily constrained, and in an atmosphere where you yourself can't sit still. Whatever image you present of yourself, whoever you think you are, and whatever you present to the world is never going to be sufficient enough. So you always have to, in some sense, re-piece together whatever you think, whatever it is that you think is going to get by and is going to be work and is going to be compelling in some kind of way. And this is true from, have lots of Instagram conversations with people from Kinshasa to Delhi to people who don't have any bread to put on the table. They also worry about what it is they're going to present of themselves. They cannot sit still. So in some ways, this becomes a kind of atmosphere, a pervasive atmosphere of what we have in some sense in common. And so thanks, Tinashe, thanks, Wiser, thanks for all the wonderful questions and the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you to all the speakers for making time for this conversation. I'm sorry to some of the attendees that we could not get to your questions, but we'll pass them on to the editors of the book, and they will be happily engaged. And thank you again to Wits University Press and Wiser for this gathering. I don't know if Nicky or Cobus has know where people can find the book or how the book can be accessed.
Yes, the book is available in South Africa. Oh yeah, it's very beautiful. Wits Press make very attractive books. It's available in South Africa via Loot and Take a Lot, but also probably via your local independent bookstore or possibly Exclusive Books. And outside South Africa, it's available through NYU Press. So if you just search it on NYU Press, you should find it. And Cobus has just told me that there's a Kindle version available as well.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.